pools and understandings in their other disciplines to better express themselves, to articulate their thinking, to draw inference from, for example, a painting when they're writing a personal narrative. And so it's really intentionally teaching the crossover between and the integration between all of those disciplines.
That's cool. That in my head, that translates to engineers will be able to write, because historically they have not, and vice versa. The artists don't know how to do math, and so I'm making broad generalizations here. But when you and I went to school, we didn't necessarily have that integrated curriculum. What we had was science class, and you answered 10 questions about the solar system, and then you were done. You weren't necessarily writing, like you said, expositorily about the solar system and telling stories. It was just Q&A, digest, regurgitate, and move on, and
Right.
things were very siloed. This is exciting. I like the integration, and we'll get to the integration of social emotional learning in a second. But I wanted to hover just for a moment on the funding component. So you mentioned tuition at like a private school, and I'll put in air quotes because we're on audio and people can't see it. The tuition, so to speak, at a public school comes from usually something called a per pupil funding that comes down from the state government by way of the federal government in some instances. What is Nevada's per pupil funding, and how do we rank among the states?
So Nevada is a little bit different. I believe we rank about 47th, I want to say, the last time I looked, in
Pretty
terms
low.
of per
Yeah.
pupil funding. Yeah, pretty low. And one of the issues that we continue to face in Nevada is that our funding is really responsive to our sales tax and some of our use taxes, and some of those funding sources that are more that change more frequently depending on economic turbulence and change. And so other states, for example, might pull more of their school funding from property taxes or from excise taxes in different ways. In Nevada, our property taxes are quite low. And those haven't tended to fluctuate very much. And so that per pupil funding primarily comes from our state budget based on our sales tax revenues. And so it does make it highly responsive to economic change, and definitely puts us at a constant need for reevaluating that budget if there are changes to the economic capacity of the state budget.
So approximately what is the dollar value that a student commands when enrolled in school?
It's around roughly $6,800, depending on there's part of it that's from the state and part comes from the local county where the student resides. Mm-hmm. So between $6,800 and $7,200 per student.
That's annually, correct?
Annually, yes.
So when we hear about, oh my gosh, you're sending your kid to school for $10,000 a year, that's actually not that far off. It sounds astronomical, but if we're 47th, it's pretty easy to draw the conclusion that many other states are probably in that 9,000 to 10,000 range anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. That's very true. And I think it's important to highlight when we talk about that in the charter world, one difference that we face is our entire operating budget comes from that per pupil allocation, or that DSA allocation per student. So whereas in some counties, the county school district might receive additional funding through additional sales tax revenues or things to pay for school buildings and those types of things. We don't have access to those funds in charter school. So we run our entire operating budget, including the expenses for our building, for our teacher salaries and curriculum, and everything from that per pupil allocation. So when we talk about that range and the capacity to even have $10,000 per student, as they do in some states, the capacity of what you can do and what that translates to in the classroom and resources for students varies tremendously.
Yeah. I don't want to bore everybody with the weeds about how schools are funded. So let's switch gears a little bit into the social emotional learning, because this, like I said, it's a mental health podcast. So you spent some time discovering this thing and studying it and integrating it into your classrooms and into your schools. What is SEL for the average listener who doesn't understand that acronym, social and emotional learning? It seems like we take that for granted, right?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And this was an interesting discovery for me, because I found that in my practice as an educator, both in the elementary and the secondary setting, a lot of these practices I did inherent in my interactions with students and with other staff members. And it wasn't until I became more involved in the work that I was able to put that title to it, the social and emotional learning title, and then dive a little bit deeper into the research behind it. And so for someone who isn't familiar with social and emotional learning, we're essentially talking about a person's capacity to be aware of themselves and their surroundings and the people around them, and to understand how their actions affect other people, how other people's actions affect them, how to build those relationship skills, and how to make good decisions based on processing all of that information simultaneously. And so it's a skill. We call this, in some contexts, you call these soft skills or emotional competencies. There's different ways of articulating it. But in 2016, I was studying at Texas Christian University, and we spent a lot of time talking about what employers thought students were lacking as they left the education world and came into the work world. And many of them from top employers in the area said, they are missing those interaction skills, those social skills, those soft skills. And the problem is those are really hard things to teach. And they said, I can teach them how to use a program. I can teach my employees how to punch a clock, or how to operate a piece of machinery, or how to build the plan the way that I want it. But I can't teach them how to understand that what they do impacts people around them, or their response to somebody's comment might impact the whole environment and social dynamic of a room. So those kinds of skills came to the forefront in terms of the awareness that this needs to be at the core of what we're doing to educate students. And we'll probably talk about a number of reasons for why this shift, but essentially it's just that capacity to make decisions, to have self-awareness, and to understand our place in relationship to those around us.
Yeah, you read my mind, because that was my next question is what happened? Like, so not just why, but when did this suddenly diverge? Because if I'm a boomer generation person listening to this podcast, and I'm going, what do you mean we need to teach kids how to interact with one another? Don't you learn that on the playground?
Yeah, that's it. It's so true, because it seems like these types of behaviors and this knowledge should be so inherent in human interactions. So there's a lot of research that indicates a shift that actually happened around 2005 with the delivery and popularity of the iPhone, and capacity that individuals had to access different types of communication and information from wherever they happen to be. And that shift, correlates with a number of things: access to the internet and social media and different avenues that really took people's attention away from the moment and involvement in their interactions in person, and took their attention to a different place and time. And in doing so, also these types of devices went not just from adults. I think I was maybe 22 when I got my first iPhone, and now, some children are 2 years old know how to operate iPhones and iPads, right, and all of these things. So definitely there's a lot of correlation to the increase in technology, social media, and how that takes away from the present and interacting with others in the present.
We had on this podcast a guy named Matt Miller. He's Dr. Matt Miller from the Veterans Health Administration. He's the director of suicide prevention program there. And I asked him about the correlation of the rise in suicide that started circa 2006 and seemed to correlate with social media and devices, mobile devices and whatnot. And he picked his words very carefully and gave a very good answer that said, it's a tool, right? It's neither good nor bad. And so we don't want to demonize the iPhone, and we don't want to demonize Facebook. What we want to do is we want to create understanding and education around what's possible with those things, and for both great and terrible. What are you seeing as far as parents' involvement in their kids' lives? Are they just throwing the devices at them and just letting them run free, or is there actual careful oversight, and is it being used appropriately and beneficially?
Yeah, that's a really good point. So in terms of parents, I have seen the pendulum swing, so to speak, in the last 10 years in education. So I think there wasn't as much awareness when these types of resources came out initially about what that translated to for students. And depending on a student's social and economic capacity, they may have had access to an iPhone at a younger age. Now the pendulum is kind of have swung, and so you actually see these classrooms and these school models that go more tech-free and limited technology use during school hours. We've had to be very intentional at educating parents, not just on what these tech use, the ramifications of these types of technology uses for their students, but also really the safety aspect of it,
Mm-hmm.
and just informing them on, everything that is accessible if you're not careful and using, proper parental controls and things like that on devices. So I see right now there's a pull to more management, and a delay use of technology that parents have. And as we see a generation of parents that grew up using these devices when they were younger, their perceptions of how that impacted their school experience and their growing up experience certainly impacts their choices for giving that to their children.
Where's the pendulum in terms of social media involvement as far as beneficial because you get to talk to your grandmother who's 5 states away, and harmful because you're spending too much time on it, consuming too much content that you can't possibly digest, and or being exposed to super toxic content? Is it swinging one direction or another? I mean, what do you
Yeah,
seeing?
I think this was hard because I saw this trend start in the last 2 years where parents really pulled back access to content and access to devices.
Hmm.
And through the last 6 months, and through families having to spend more time at home, and less access to some of the other activities that students would normally be doing, it's come back a little bit as a way to um, be a source of entertainment and connection, like you said, Skyping with grandma if she's, quarantined at home 2 states away, and that kind of thing. So it'll be very interesting to see where we go this coming year, because I think we're at a turning point in terms of blending the access to these devices and to these programs for the purposes of education and connection in a very positive way. And I think we're going to see people more excited to embrace the interpersonal worlds, because we've been a little bit deprived from those interactions for a while.
I have long lamented the instant gratification that has kind of consumed our culture through the use of technology. And as awesome as it is just to go to the Google machine and return an instant result, it seems like we've lost the work ethic of going to the library card catalog. And I just pick those as examples, but there are myriad more that we could hold out as examples of how things have changed. And I get that you can be more productive and there's benefit to doing things faster and so forth. But what I'm seeing is a lack of distress tolerance. And this comes back to the social and emotional learning, where when I was forced to look up something in the encyclopedia or in the library card catalog, I had no other choice but to be patient. And I could maybe rifle through the cards faster, but as fast as my thumbs would go and quickly as I could process the alphabet. But it seems to me that kids these days, kids these days, and adults too, because I'm seeing it trickle up. I'm seeing it myself. I'm seeing it my parents, even in their generation. We're losing the ability to tolerate the distress of not getting things instantly. The internet waffles for just a second, and we are shaking our fists and frothing at the mouth. And some of that is just, I expect what I want delivered through the contract I signed with my internet service provider to be delivered. Okay, I get that. But the other one is like, whoa, we're way too emotionally intolerant these days. And I'm wondering if you're seeing or you have a certain judgment or assessment about that. I certainly think it's bad. But are you seeing the same thing I'm seeing? And do you think it's good or bad or indifferent?
Yeah, well, what's interesting, in 2006, I was working at a high school in a rural town in Texas, and the principal had been in education for about 30 years. And she said, I used to be able to